¿Qué tal? Muy buen día. Pues en este nuevo ciclo de videoconferencias, el día de hoy estamos pues muy contentos porque vamos a contar con la presencia no nada más de una gran investigadora de aquí de casa del instituto, sino que también pues bueno, vamos en esta ocasión a trascender un poquito fronteras y tenemos un invitado muy especial. El día de hoy esta videoconferencia, pues bueno, antes que nada, reciban el saludo como siempre del doctor Mauricio Hernández, que es nuestro director, y también de nuestra secretaria académica, la doctora Laura Magaña Valladares, de aquí del Instituto Nacional de Salud Pública. Pues bien, continuando como les comentaba yo, en este esfuerzo de trascender fronteras y de estar siempre a la vanguardia en estos temas que afortunadamente pues bueno, son de interés general y son de interés en particular también de un sector muy importante de personas que en esta ocasión van a tener una videoconferencia muy interesante, de los que somos de alguna manera pasivos y de los que son activos. Me refiero al tema de hoy, que es modelos de simulación de las políticas de control de tabaco. Así es que pues antes que nada quisiera yo recibir con mucho agrado a la doctora Miriam Reynales Shigematsu y también al doctor David Levy. Con ustedes pues vamos a tratar de leer una pequeña y breve cápsula académica de ellos dos, porque como siempre lo comento, estamos en estos ciclos de videoconferencia llenos de gente que han sido muy importantes en estos temas de investigación, y contamos con ellos y además nos sentimos muy orgullosos porque son gente de casa. Pues bueno, si me permiten, la doctora Miriam Reynales, ella es médica cirujana egresada del Colegio Mayor de Nuestra Señora del Rosario en Bogotá, Colombia. Especialista en medicina del trabajo de la Escuela Colombiana de Medicina, cursó la maestría en ciencias y el doctorado en salud pública con énfasis en epidemiología en la Escuela de Salud Pública de México. En la actualidad es jefa del Departamento de Investigación sobre Tabaco, aquí en casa, en el Instituto Nacional de Salud Pública. Es investigador en Ciencias Médicas y miembro del Sistema Nacional de Investigadores, el SNI número 1. Ella ha participado como asesora en el área de medicina del trabajo y liderado proyectos de implementación de sistemas de información en salud en los diferentes actores del sistema de salud colombiano. En México, ella ha liderado proyectos de investigación en las áreas de estimación de costos de atención médica de enfermedades crónicas y el cáncer, y de evaluación de impacto epidemiológico y económico de factores de riesgos como el tabaco, el virus del papiloma humano y contaminantes ambientales. Actualmente participa activamente en la elaboración de políticas públicas para el control de tabaco a nivel federal y local. Pues bueno, una amplia trayectoria que tiene la doctora, y pues obviamente sin quedarnos atrás vamos a tratar de leer la cápsula del doctor David Levy. El doctor Levy tiene un doctorado en economía por parte de la UCLA y actualmente es profesor de oncología en la Universidad de Georgetown. Él ha publicado más de 170 artículos en numerosas revistas internacionales. Su investigación reciente se centra en el control del tabaco, el abuso de sustancias, la obesidad y otros problemas de salud pública. Él ha sido investigador principal obteniendo financiamientos de los Institutos Nacionales del Alcoholismo y Abuso del Alcohol, los Centros para el Control y Prevención de Enfermedades, la Organización Mundial de la Salud, el Instituto Nacional del Cáncer, el Programa de Investigación de Enfermedades relacionadas con el tabaco, Bloomberg Philanthropies, la Unión Europea y la Fundación Robert Wood Johnson. Actualmente es el investigador principal de la subvención de 5 años a partir de la intervención sobre el cáncer del Instituto Nacional del Cáncer y el programa de vigilancia a través de Modelo. El doctor Levy ha supervisado el diseño y desarrollo de modelos de simulación de políticas de tabaco, SimSmoke, Este modelo predice el efecto de las políticas de tabaco, tales como aumentos de impuestos, leyes de ambientes libres de humo, campañas de medios de comunicación, políticas de acceso a la juventud y tratamiento de la cesación tabáquica, y muestra cómo se pueden implementar con mayor eficacia estas políticas. Ha publicado más de 60 artículos sobre el modelo y los problemas de control de tabaco relacionado, más recientemente sobre los efectos de la prohibición del mentol. Ha desarrollado modelos también para Estados Unidos y otros estados, más de 30 países, que cubre el 85% de la población mundial. Este modelo ha sido utilizado en la formulación de las políticas nacionales y estatales. Recientemente, el Dr. Levy ha incursionado en la modelación de las políticas de tratamiento de la cesación, el uso de productos de tabaco sin humo, efectos en la salud materna e infantil, y la modelación de políticas sobre el alcohol y el control de la obesidad. Así es que, como siempre les comento, estamos de manteles largos, de vajilla de porcelana china, de cubiertos de plata, y bueno, ¿qué más decir? Para ustedes, yo creo que para mí también una gran oportunidad de tener a estos investigadores aquí. Y pues bueno, doctora,
muchísimas gracias
Miriam,
por la invitación.
Dr. Levy.
Thank you.
Thank you. Y pues bueno, vamos a empezar con esta videoconferencia, y pues no nos queda más que decirle al doctor Levy que por favor se sienta a gusto, se sienta cómodo e inicie su presentación, puesto que tenemos un público en salas de videoconferencia y a través de Webex que están deseosos de escuchar. Dr. Levy, feel comfortable to start your video conference.
Today I'm going to be talking about modeling, and I'll be focusing particularly on tobacco policy, where most of my work has been done. I've done a little bit of work on obesity. I'll mention that a little bit, but I'd like to focus mostly on tobacco today. Modeling, also known under several different names, simulation models, computational models, has been used in other fields. For example, modeling has been widely used in urban planning and especially in traffic control. Traffic, as you're well aware, is very complex, and modeling is a way of understanding that complexity and being able to work with it in a way where you can deal with the essential elements. Modeling has recently become more common in public health. First, it was used in understanding infectious diseases, where modeling helped understand the spread of diseases. More recently, it's now being used in the fields of tobacco control and obesity. Modeling is especially useful in these areas because there are many stages. The complexity arises because we want to know the relationship between policies, and ultimately we want to know the effects on public health. To understand that, however, there are many different stages. The policies themselves, like a change in tobacco taxes, affects the environment, affects how much people have to spend, leading them to spend more or less, affecting behaviors. That's going to affect how many cigarettes they use, which will ultimately affect health. But the effects on health take many years till they're realized. So modeling helps to look at these behaviors which unfold over time. Modeling also helps to understand the interrelations between the whole, between each of these stages. To really understand public health, you need to understand it as part of a whole system, not just an isolated part. I think probably, in my view, what's made modeling particularly useful is it's provided a way of bringing together information from many different sources. When we do a statistical study, we usually do a study that considers the interrelationship between one part of the system. For example, we look at the effect of a tax. We see how that affects spending on cigarettes. We don't look at necessarily how long it takes to quit, and we definitely it becomes very difficult to look at the effects on health. So modeling provides a way of bringing together different information: the relationship between taxes and spending, the relationship between spending and cigarette use, and ultimately the relationships between cigarette use and health. It provides a structure. It also allows us to consider different aspects of the system. For example, if we increase taxes by $1, we might see one effect. If we increase it by another $1, there may be a different effect. It may be larger, it may be smaller. We call these nonlinear relationships. Oftentimes with policies, we need to see them not just done in a small way, but a large way before they have important effects. Also, the effects of one policy may depend on other policies that are in effect. For example, the effects of a tax may depend on whether there are other policies, such as educational policies. The way the effects occur over time, it becomes very important also. They may occur within a couple of years. They may take many years until they fully have effects. And then the effects may depend on other actors within the system. Public policies are conducted by government. The tobacco industry can react, and when they react, that can affect the way the policy affects behaviors, and we call that feedback loops. So all of these things are part of a larger system, and a fairly complex system, and this is where modeling helps us not only be able to predict, but also to understand better how policies work in this larger system. There are two types of models usually that are discussed. The first is macro simulations, where the focus is on groups of individuals. For example, the distinction between current, former, and never smokers may be further distinguished by age and gender groups. And you look at how these effects occur over time. That's called unidirectional causality. If you do have feedback loops in those systems, we call it systems dynamic, and that would allow, for example, for the industry feedbacks into the system. The other type of modeling is known as micro simulations. Here, the modeling is in terms of individuals. Usually what's done is you try to get a structure where the individuals are representative of the population, and the way you do that is you get distributions and then have random random recall from those distributions to replicate the population. One of the interesting aspects of this system is you can allow specific kinds of behavior. You can allow social interactions, that's known as network modeling, and you could look at how these different interactions affect the system as a whole. Increasingly what's been recognized, for example, as I mentioned before, in infectious diseases, it spreads throughout the population. In tobacco and obesity control, what we've seen is that much depends on the area in which a person lives. And we refer to this as social networks, and this is very important in understanding the use of tobacco. So why focus on tobacco? Well, tobacco control is one of the areas where we've seen one of the greatest public health stories. What I'm going to try to do today is to show you the immense impact that tobacco control has had. And what makes it particularly startling even is that we're talking about a behavior that's addictive, yet we see large effects. The other aspect of smoking that I think makes it interesting is that there is the more direct link to health. There's been many studies, and they found very clearly that when you begin smoking, how much you smoke, age you quit, and so on, are very clearly linked to health outcomes, in particular to lung cancer, but also to heart disease. In comparison to obesity, the interactions are much more complex. The health effects depend on nutrition, what you eat, your eating habits over the course of your life, and also your exercise. I'll be focusing on a model which I started developing about 15 years ago, and it's known as SimSmoke. SimSmoke is a macro model, or what's also called a compartmental model, and looks at the dynamics of smoking rates, categorizing smoke, current, former, and never smokers over time, and how that affects smoking attributed deaths in a state or nation. And then looks at the effects of policies on those outcomes. And I think it shows in a very special way how modeling can be used to look at complex systems. What we've tried to do in SimSmoke is to take into account the way in which the policy is implemented, different effects by age and gender. More recently, we're looking at different effects by socioeconomic groups also, and also the length of time that the policy is in effect, and finally how the policy depends on other policies in effect. So again, SimSmoke looks at a system in stages. The first stage is the policies, and we focus so far on the main policies which have been shown to affect smoking cigarette use, and those are taxes, clean air laws, media campaigns, marketing restrictions, warning labels, cessation treatment policies, and youth access. And we've tried to look at it in a very systematic way, how it affects the attitudes and norms in a population, and also the opportunities. Now these effects occur on smokers, but this leads, the effects that this has will depend on relative risks. So we've also modeled the effects on smoking attributable deaths. We've looked at those deaths in total. We've also looked at them by type. We've looked at lung cancers, other cancers, heart disease, stroke, and COPD. These are the main health effects, although there are many other health effects also that people are looking at now. For example, effects on diabetes, effects on even fertility issues. Recently, we've also looked at how smoking affects maternal and child health outcomes. These are particularly important because when a mother smokes, it affects the child, and that child will then, if they're born with a low birth weight, the effects can carry through their entire life, which is not only tragic from a health point of view, but also means very high economic costs. So again, the focus is on policies. And when we developed this model, we first looked at the evidence from the literature. We looked specifically at the effect of tobacco policies, but we also looked at other risky behaviors. For example, I've done some work also on alcohol policies, and we looked at those policies to also get a gauge and to help understand policies. We then tried to, when we did our literature reviews, we tried to take into account how that policy worked. And we did that by bringing into our analyses, we did very extensive literature reviews, but we tried to bring in economics, sociology, psychology, and epidemiology. And I must thank, and very important in this, is my expert panel. In doing this, I think probably the success we've had in developing these models is largely due to the people that were brought together from different disciplines and helped us weave the literature into models which were which could understand the system in a comprehensive way and can also explain the evidence. The main policies, as I mentioned, and we have listed again, are the tobacco taxes, the smoke-free air laws, media campaigns, marketing, health warnings, cessation treatment, and I'll talk more about those later, and youth access. Now, one thing that is important in modeling is you can start a model from today and project forward. What we've done is we've tried to start models back in time so that we could gauge how well they're working. And when we do that, we have what's called a tracking period. A tracking period we usually try to start in terms of a year before important policies are being implemented. For example, right now I'm developing a model for Mexico, and we're starting that model before 2004 when many of the policies, many of the more active policies were being implemented. This gives us provides us the opportunity to calibrate the model, that is, develop trends which look reasonable given past trends in smoking rates, and then also to validate the model and look at the role of past policies, and I'll show you soon how that's done. Now, when you start the model from current year, you just project forward. If the model has been well validated, has been shown to work in other places, this is also a useful way of looking at the effects of policies. And here you could look at the effects of different policies. You can look at how different policies can help us reach different goals. Now, I've been very lucky in that SimSmoke has been widely used. You see here we have models now for 32 different countries. And what we've tried to do is document very carefully for these countries. And in so doing, we've not only described the models but their effects, and we've been able to publish papers for many of the different countries. We've also had papers for various states. Again, you know, the more a policy, a model is validated, the more credibility that model has. Okay, so now I've given you a introduction to the SimSmoke model, told you a little bit about it. Next, I'd like to discuss with you 3 of the potential uses of modeling. Not just, I'll talk about the uses for my model, but these are uses that can be seen for modeling in general. The first is advocacy. That is, you want to know the effects of policies, you want to know how they've contributed to health outcomes, and show what would happen in the absence of those policies. This is what, in today's world, where costs are important, as they always are, it's important to justify and show that policies are effective. Once you have had policies and you can show their effects, you want to know, well, how can you improve things? And here we talk about planning, and we'll talk about how SimSmoke has used to rank different interventions, show how it's been used to reach various goals, and also how it fits in with surveillance and evaluation networks. And finally, and to me, maybe most importantly, when I began doing modeling, the focus was on prediction. What I soon learned was, in doing modeling, you find out not only what you do know, but what you don't know. And this we refer to as the heuristic aspects of modeling. And this means how modeling helps us understand systems. Okay, so first I'm going to talk about Brazil. We talked about success stories. Brazil is one of the really outstanding success stories that we've seen in public health. Now, what we did when we developed the model is we first developed a model, and we saw how well it predicted. And the model predicted very well. We started the model in 1989, which was before major policies in Brazil. And then we had data for later years, and we saw that the model predicted well. It predicted well. We had data for 2003. We then had later for data for 2009 and 10, and the model did very well. Once we saw that the model did well and predicted policies, we went back and looked at what would have happened if those policies had not been adopted. And we call that the counterfactual. What would have happened in the absence of the policies? We then compared what happened in the absence of policies to actual policies, and that gave us an idea of the effect of different policies. And then we used that to look at the impact of policies on deaths due to smoking. Here we see not only the outcomes of the model, but also the predictions in the absence of policy. The top line is the counterfactual. That's what. Well, let me start it differently. Let's start it at the red line. The red line is the actual predictions of the model, which we said were validated. And what you see is, over time, first there were cigarette taxes, then there were health warnings and important advertising restrictions and some smoke-free air laws. Then you had youth access policies and stronger laws, further increases in taxes, and then finally you had some very strong smoke-free air policies. And you see that when the policies occur, there are large reductions in the smoking rates. And again, when we looked at the data, we found out that the predictions of the model coincided well with that data. Then we looked at the effects of individual policies. The second line from the red line up is the blue line, and that was the effect of prices alone. We see that prices alone explain a large part of the change. This is not unusual. Pricing policies have been important in many different countries. As a matter of fact, I would say that in all the countries where we've seen major improvements, we've seen large increases in price through taxes. The top line shows a very slight decrease in smoking rates over time. That's the counterfactual. That's what we would predict would have happened in the absence of policies. And if you look at most countries, what you see is a very slow decline in smoking rates if policies are not implemented. Doing this exercise, we were able to distinguish the role of the different policies. And what you see here is that the biggest effects come through price. And again, this is very typical. But you also see big effects through advertising restrictions and smoke-free air policies. And it's become now a conventional wisdom that these policies, as well as media campaigns, are the essential policies in explaining which countries have been most successful. What we have here is, this shows the effects in the previous slide, where we saw graphically the effects of smoking on smoking rates. And what we have here is the specific numbers. We have the predictions of the model with actual policies. We also have the counterfactual, which is again the effects in the absence of policies. What you see here by looking at the top part on smoking prevalence is that we predict by 2000 there was a reduction in smoking rates of over 27% as a result of policies, and that reached about 46% by the year 2050. Now, you also notice here we have upper and lower bounds. When we do modeling, we take into account that there's uncertainty in our predictions. So the range we have here gives our best estimate of the range of plausible effects of policy, and what's suggested here is that the effects are between about 28% and 66%. Finally, we have the effects projected out to the year 2050, and we project that policies implemented between 1989 and 2050 are responsible for almost a 60% reduction in smoking rates. We predict that out by 2050, smoking rates will be 10% compared to the 17% where they were in about 2010. Now, based on the actual policies and the counterfactual policies, we're able to also use standard methods of epidemiology to calculate the number of deaths that can be attributed to smoking. And these are shown in the bottom half of this table. And you see that by 2010 we project about 5 million deaths due to smoking, and by 2050 about 13 million. But in the absence of smoking, what we would project is that there would have been by 2050 about 20 million deaths. So the difference between policy, smoking rates with policies and the counterfactual gives us an estimate of the number of lives saved. So what the model predicts is about 400,000 lives saved by 2010. Now, what we need to understand is when people quit smoking, they still have risks. And it's only slowly over time that we see the primary benefits. And when we look at the effects by 2050, we see almost 7 million lives saved. Again, an example of the tremendous effects of public health and of tobacco policies in particular. We also projected out the number of maternal child health outcomes avoided. And you see here that we predict that 704,000, or almost 705,000 low birth weight babies have been avoided as a result of the policies. Again, you know, this is really not only an important effect in terms of the public health, but also has tremendous economic implications. Okay, so I've shown you the effects for Brazil. Brazil is one of the countries where we've seen some of the biggest effects, and here I have listed, you know, based on not all, but some of the different models which I have written about the effects of policies. You see the biggest effects in Brazil and California. You also see large effects in the United Kingdom, Minnesota, and Thailand, and also rather large effects for Arizona, Korea, Ireland, New York State, and the Netherlands. Now, what is it that these countries all have in common? Well, the answer is simple. They've all had large increases in price, but they've also had important other policies that have been implemented at the same time or soon after the price increases. So the bottom line story here is, and this has been replicated again, not only in my work but other work, is that tobacco control can have large effects, and they can have particularly large effects in countries where many policies are excuse me, simultaneously implemented. One thing I would also mention is in two of the countries we actually under-predicted excuse me one sec. We under-predicted the effects of policies, and those were Brazil and the United Kingdom. And what stands out about these countries is that they had very innovative policies. Brazil had very striking, they've led the world in health warnings. The United Kingdom has had a very comprehensive cessation treatment policies, and as a result, the effects are even better than what my model has predicted. Okay, so what do we also learn from these models? Well, what we've seen, and now that I've done these models for many different countries, you know, I've seen certain patterns. And the basic thing that comes out of these policies, that if you implement all of these policies and implement them close together in time, you can have large reductions. Now, what we predict, based on the literature, and I think this is fairly conservative, is that you could reduce smoking rates by 50%, perhaps a little more. So this tells us not only what kind of effects policies can have, but also that we may need other policies. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the other potential policies that we might think about. For example, improved cessation treatment, and also to alter the tobacco products available, that is in terms of their availability and or their contents. Now I'd like to move on to planning, and what I'd like to talk about first is monitoring systems, and I want to show you an example from the United States, because this is something I often see, and that is, you know, when I do a model, I compare it to the data, and here you see the predictions that I've done for one of my models, that is for Minnesota, and you see that the data is kind of what we would say all over the place. Different surveys give different predictions. What modeling forces you to do is look at these surveys and look at what they mean, because surveys often do give different predictions, so it's very important to consider how those surveys are done. Now, one of the examples I like to use is Ireland. And here you see there were essentially, we did the model. The blue line represents the model. And then we had two different sets of surveys. We had, the red is one set of surveys known as the OTC. It was done yearly, so it was very useful in validating the model, and we did quite well according to that data. Now, we also had a survey known as the standard, looked at living standards, and that's referred to as the SLAN model. And you notice that we were above for 2002, and our predictions were above. And the top X is the data that I was originally presented when we looked at how well the model is doing, and that was the SLAN data for 2007. And according to the SLAN data, it appeared that smoking rates, despite the fact that Ireland had some very important policies, and Ireland is known for its smoke-free air law policies. They also had major increases in taxes. It seemed like the model wasn't doing very well. We were predicting rates below the level. So I went to Ireland and I discussed the model with them, and they told me that there was a very important change in the surveys and how they were conducted between 2002 and 2007. And that important distinction was that they started including cell phones. And in Ireland, during this period also, there was a large in-migration, particularly from Eastern Europe. And so what we did was we looked at those particular individuals from Eastern Europe, and they did have very high smoking rates, and so in a sense we weren't comparing things correctly over time because the way the survey was conducted had changed. So what we did was we took out this group because they were a new group in the surveys, these recent immigrants with high smoking rates, and lo and behold, the model predicted almost exactly on target. And I show you this not so much to show what SimSmoke is capable of, but the importance of looking at how surveys are conducted. And in Mexico, again, you have many surveys, and they ask many different kinds of questions. Like, for example, a survey might start asking, do you currently smoke? A different survey might ask, how many cigarettes have you smoked over your lifetime? These have very different implications, and it becomes particularly important for Mexico, where there are many someday smokers. One of the reasons why I've been particularly excited to work to model smoking behaviors in Mexico is because of the circumstances surrounding someday and everyday smokers. Now, another part of the planning is to look at the effects of future policies. For Brazil, they've had many policies already in effect, but there is the potential to continue to have additional effects through stronger policies. And what we look at here are the effects of a tax increase. It was about 60%. We looked at increasing the tax to about 70%. We looked at extending smoke-free air laws, not just from several cities as it was in 2010, but to the whole country, from going to a fairly strong set of marketing restrictions to very strong marketing restrictions, and to strong media campaigns. And we see here the ranking of different policies. And again, what we see is taxes continue to have the potential to have strong effects. We also see that the big effects can come from implemented implementing many policies simultaneously. So what we do is rank in terms of the percentage reduction attributed to individual policies, and then also we look at the excuse me, number of deaths avoided as a result of policies. Again, this gives you an illustration of a point I made before, and that is that the effects are delayed. So the importance is that you can have policies now. You will see effects on smoking rates, but the primary effects on health are in the future. And that's particularly true of cancers, less true of heart disease and child health outcomes, where the effects are immediate. If a woman does not smoke while pregnant, it greatly reduces the likelihood of adverse outcomes such as low birth weight babies or preterm births. Another use that we've had is in the United States now. The FDA has recently been given greater authority to regulate products, and they've been required to show the effects of those products on the public health, and so modeling becomes particularly important. One of the first things they considered was banning menthol. And menthol is of particular importance because it's smoked by youth. That is, most youth who begin smoking in the United States begin with smoking menthol cigarettes. And also it's been found that menthol smokers have lower quit rates than other smokers. So what we did was they wanted to know, well, if we ban menthol, what kind of outcome could that have? So we looked at the literature, and based on that literature, we came up with what we thought were reasonable effects of menthol. We looked at the effect on quit rates, and we looked at the effects on initiation, and we considered three different scenarios. One was that 10% of the former smokers would quit, and 10% of those who would have initiated with menthol would not initiate. That was our lower bound. For a midpoint estimate, we looked at 20% rates, and for an upper bound, based on the literature again, we looked at for 30% rates. And what we have here is that the effects that we predicted as a result, and in particular these effects published in the American Journal of Public Health, are for the different scenarios, and it suggests that there were important effects of banning menthol. We predicted somewhere between 200,000 and 600,000 deaths avoided if menthol were to be banned. Now, also of interest, because the African American population in the United States tends to use menthol cigarettes, was the effect it would have on that particular racial group. And we projected that particular group would have large savings, and this is important not only in terms of the implications for that group, but also in terms of the racial and ethnic disparities in the United States. So this became important evidence for the FDA. Okay, so we've talked about advocacy and planning. The last area I'd like to talk about is the heuristic use of modeling. And here I'll talk about the modeling of some of the particular policies that I've looked at first, and then talk about how I've modeled the use of other tobacco products. One of the first policies I looked at when I began developing the SimSmoke model was youth access policies. And what we mean by youth access policies are those which not only make it illegal for youth to purchase, but also enforce those laws. And the enforcement we refer to as retail compliance. And I looked at the literature and I saw that some of the studies found there were important effects, other studies found no small effects, and other studies found no effects. So I was somewhat baffled, being new to the area in particular. And so what we tried to do was to try to understand the different policies. And again, important in my modeling efforts have been the expert panel, and they told me there were two important factors that needed to be considered. And these are the fact that youth not only get their cigarettes by purchasing them at stores, but they get them from other sources. They get them from parents, they get them from older friends, and even some of the cigarettes are obtained through theft, which shows the importance of point-of-sale displays and so on. Also, what was important was the level and extent of policies. So based on this information, we actually developed a model. And what that model showed and was able to explain in the variation of results is that the effects depend on three critical elements. They depend on publicity, they depend on compliance checks, and they depend on the extent of penalties that were implemented. And when we took these into account, we saw that we could explain the variation in these different studies. Now, when we look at publicity, we recognize also that publicity primary effects are through anti-tobacco norms, and other policies also affect these norms. So this brings into account what we call a synergy. And in particular, we saw that in the areas where there were other policies like media campaigns, we saw more compliance. That is, fewer stores would sell to youth. What we also saw is that it depended very much on the extent of compliance. And what I mean by this is that you can reduce the number of retailers selling to youth by 10%, 20%, 30%, 50%, 60%, or 70%, and see very little effects. What you really needed to see was that you reached very high levels of compliance. And the example that we discussed was New York City. If you had even 10% of stores selling to youth, this could be a problem. Why? And this was before the internet. Now I think the problems would be even much more pronounced. As soon as there are some retailers selling to youth, youth find out and are able to purchase. So you needed to have things at very high levels of compliance. And this again points out how the effects depend very much on the level of the policy. Another type of policy which we modeled, and we have a very extensive model, is on cessation treatment policies. And what we did there was we looked at the quitting process. We looked at the decision to make a quit attempt, and we looked at the use of different treatments that have proven effective and the rates of success associated with that treatment. So this was our underlying model, and then over that we have supplanted the effects of particular policies. And the particular policies we looked at were those of the different types of treatment available, that is, whether there's nicotine replacement policy, and we consider whether it's available over the counter or by prescription, And then we also considered 2 types of treatments that are usually only, in most countries, only by prescription, and that's bupropion and varenicline. We then looked at access to policies, that is, whether or not these policies were provided in particular types of treatment, and also whether or not the extent to which the smoker had to pay for these policies. Then we looked at quit lines and brief interventions, that is, the involvement of the healthcare providers, that is, whether or not they gave advice to quit, and also the use of web-based treatments. So these were the primary policies we looked at and their availability, but then we also, based on the literature, looked at the follow-up of care. And based on this, we found a couple of things. One, the importance of other policies. Again, media campaigns can be very important. Tax increases can be important because they can encourage quit attempts. But then having these other policies in place, and particularly having follow-up of care, you can greatly increase the effects of these other policies. These other most of the other tobacco control policies affect quit attempts. Cessation treatments help ensure that those quit attempts are successful. So modeling helped understand the system and how it was important to combine different policies. Single policies by themselves may not have that big of an effect, but when they're combined, there's potential synergies. Finally, one of the heuristic aspects of policies was looking at the effects of other kinds of policies. And we did this in a model we have for Sweden. You know, in Sweden, they've had a product known as snus, which is a type of smokeless tobacco which has been found to be of much lower risk than smoking. I've done some studies, and based on those studies, we found that the risks of using snus are somewhere between 2 and 10% that of cigarettes. So that has important implications. And what we tried to understand was how this affects smoking. And so we did models where we looked at the effects. And what we looked at, and what becomes very important, is sole versus dual use. And that becomes important because a sole cigarette smoker has the highest risks. Now, if they use smokeless, potentially there's lower risks because there's lower quantity smoked. And this has important implications for cancer. However, we have to take into account that those who initiate smoking smokeless may become smokers, in particular may become dual smokers and smokeless users. So we brought that into the model, as well as looking at sole smokeless use, which carries the lowest risks. And based on that, we did models and we projected trends over time. And what we found was that smokeless did have important implications. And though, however, the implications that were seen early seem to be less prominent now. That is, smokeless, instead of being a replacement for smoking, in more recent years seems to be an added type of tobacco use which has its own health implications. So, in general, modeling now provides a way of thinking about the effects of different products and how those effects depend on their use, whether smokers become new users or dual users, whether youth use these products instead of cigarettes, or whether they eventually use cigarettes. You know, and these are the things that determine whether these new products increase harm or reduce harm. And finally, how former smokers use these. former smokers can avoid becoming smokers by turning to these products. So now we're developing products models to look at these outcomes. In the United States, e-cigarettes have become very important, and so we're using models to look at the potential implications and how we might regulate e-cigarettes so that they reduce harm rather than increase harm by keeping people smokers rather than quitting. And so again, modeling provides a framework, and it provides a way not only of looking at the implications on behavior, but also looking at the complexity of the system. And here I give you some of the ways in which we're looking at extending the SimSmoke model, that is, looking at industry behavior, the feedback loops to policy. We're looking then at how industry behavior and tobacco control policies affect the environment and thereby risky behaviors. We're also looking into models of involving genetics, because genetics can play an important role in behaviors. And again, these become important if we're going to understand the whole system and how we can target policies to affect those people who are currently smokers. Final point that I'd like to bring into I'd like to make is that I've talked about one model, a model now that we've seen applied to many different countries. So I hope you. I think it's a model where we've had more experience, and I've tried to share those experiences. Much of the modeling has been done as part of a group called SysNet, and this is a group of cancer modelers. And what we have emphasized, and what becomes very important in modeling, is that modelers are very document their model very carefully. They document the data they use, they document the assumptions that are made, they provide confidence intervals, and they make this information publicly available. In efforts, I'm sure, of the FDA in the United States and in general on modeling efforts, it becomes very important to compare the results of different models, because different models make different assumptions, and by comparing different models is the only way to really get a good gauge of the likely effects that can be seen. So my parting message is not only that models are important, but you use different models, you compare those models, and you use those models not only to understand policies, but also to provide a basis for sound decision making. Thank you.
Bueno, buenas tardes. Queremos darle las gracias al doctor Levy por esta excelente presentación que nos ha hecho. Él ha tenido que salir a otra reunión con investigadores en el instituto, pero quisiera finalizar esta última parte de la conferencia de hoy retomando algunas diapositivas que él nos ha presentado para compartirles con ustedes cuál es la experiencia que estamos teniendo aquí en el Instituto Nacional de Salud Pública y específicamente con los datos mexicanos en este modelo de simulación, y con base en esto también apalancar un poco con ustedes cuál es la situación de la problemática del tabaquismo en México y de las políticas de control. Entonces, vamos a mirar las diapositivas. Sí. Miramos un poco esta parte de los modelos de simulación, un poco el Instituto Nacional de Salud Pública ha tenido la oportunidad de participar en varios modelos de simulación en México. Uno, básicamente para hacer una evaluación ambiental de las políticas de ambientes, de contaminación ambiental en la Ciudad de México, en el Valle de México. Otro modelo de simulación, básicamente en el cual hemos tenido la oportunidad de trabajar, es un modelo de simulación de la vacuna del virus del papiloma humano. Y estos modelos de simulación en el cual estamos participando en el tema del tabaco, en el cual básicamente tenemos la oportunidad de trabajar de manera simultánea con el doctor Levy, haciendo este modelo de macro simulación, pero también estamos trabajando con un grupo de argentinos haciendo un modelo de microsimulación. Entonces un poco me voy a apalancar en estas diapositivas que nos presentó el doctor Levy y vamos a contar un poco cuál ha sido la experiencia de México y cuál ha sido también la importancia. Entonces un poco estos modelos de simulación nos han permitido reconstruir históricamente el comportamiento de la epidemia, o sea, del factor de riesgo, del comportamiento del consumo de tabaco, así también como reproducir su impacto tanto en la mortalidad por enfermedades atribuibles al tabaco, como nos lo había presentado con anterioridad. El otro punto que también es muy interesante en este tipo de modelos es que no solamente involucramos el aspecto epidemiológico, sino que también estamos involucrando algunos aspectos demográficos, poblacionales, y también introducimos algunos aspectos de carácter económico, de impacto económico, que a la hora de tener argumentos para posicionar una problemática de salud pública resulta muy interesante también dar este tipo de información. En la modelación que estamos haciendo en este momento tenemos varios retos, como lo comentaba el doctor anteriormente. Generalmente estamos combinando ciertos datos que vienen de encuestas nacionales. Como él lo habló, tenemos la encuesta nacional de adicciones, la encuesta nacional de salud, tenemos encuestas globales como la encuesta global de tabaquismo en adultos, y también tenemos algunas encuestas en adolescentes como la encuesta de tabaquismo en jóvenes. Entonces, como ustedes pueden ver, tenemos un gran abanico de fuentes de información en los cuales podemos estimar realmente cuál es el consumo de tabaco en la población mexicana, cómo se está dando las diferencias por hombres, por mujeres, por grupos de edad, por diferentes regiones del país. Y bueno, esto nos permite, al tener gran cantidad de información, nos permite que la información que estamos introduciendo al modelo pues sea de mayor precisión. El otro punto que también es muy importante es que nos permite también mirar el impacto sobre la morbimortalidad. Entonces, básicamente con fuentes de información a partir de las estadísticas de mortalidad del INEGI, nosotros podemos tener específicamente cuánto ha sido la mortalidad en el país y cuánta de esa mortalidad se debe a las principales causas atribuibles al consumo de tabaco. También es otra información que está disponible en el país, que es pública, que podemos introducir al modelo y con toda confianza, digamos, poder hacer esta modelación de la cual hablábamos anteriormente. Otro punto que también es muy importante es, bueno, ¿cuál ha sido el comportamiento de las políticas de control del tabaco? Si bien es cierto, México lleva muchísimos años en el tema del control del tabaco, posterior al año 2004, que fue cuando se firmó y se ratificó el convenio marco de la Organización Mundial de la Salud para el Control del Tabaco, se han venido detonando una serie de políticas de las cuales pues todos hemos sido partícipes y beneficiarios como tal. En el 2008 tuvimos una modificación, una nueva ley, la Ley General para el Control del Tabaco, que es de carácter federal y en la cual se regulan, digamos, algunos aspectos que considero que es muy importante tener en cuenta y que vamos a discutir. Entonces, lo que nos va a ayudar este modelo de simulación es a evaluar cuál ha sido el impacto y cuál ha sido el efecto, tanto en términos epidemiológicos de morbimortalidad, en el haber aplicado este tipo de políticas a nivel nacional. Este SimSmoke es, como lo habíamos hablado anteriormente, es un modelo de simulación macro en el cual estamos trabajando con 3 grupos importantes, los fumadores, los exfumadores y los que nunca han fumado. Ese es un punto muy importante para definir en todo modelo de simulación y en este caso particular. Vamos a tener datos desagregados por género, hombres y mujeres, dado que el comportamiento de la epidemia difiere en estos 2 grupos, y también vamos a tener el comportamiento en los diferentes grupos de edad de la población. Como ustedes saben, las tendencias de las encuestas nosotros observamos, si bien es cierto, las tendencias de las encuestas nos dicen que la epidemia se está estacionalizando, se ha reducido en algunos grupos poblacionales de adultos, como es en el caso de los hombres. Si nosotros tenemos una perspectiva solo de los adolescentes, estamos viendo el caso contrario, donde hay un incremento del consumo en este grupo poblacional, y donde nos llama muchísimo la atención que las mujeres están fumando, digamos, a la misma proporción que lo hacen los jóvenes. Entonces, esto es muy importante modelarlo, porque el impacto que vamos a tener en términos de daños a la salud, en términos de morbimortalidad, va a ser bastante diferente por tanto grupos de edad como también por hombres y mujeres. Este otro punto que también me parece muy importante que debemos tener en cuenta es el de el enfoque básico del modelo. El doctor Levy hablaba básicamente de los marcos conceptuales. Entonces, pues con la revisión de la literatura, tanto a nivel global como también la literatura científica que se ha producido en México, entonces nosotros estamos alimentando el modelo en cuanto a las características de la política, en términos de los impuestos, en términos de ambientes libres de humo de tabaco, en términos de las campañas en medios de comunicación, en términos de la prohibición total de la publicidad, promoción y patrocinio, los tratamientos para cesación y la prohibición de venta a menores y de cigarrillos sueltos. Estas son las diferentes políticas que se están evaluando en el modelo. Luego, como les había hablado anteriormente, a través de las encuestas estamos caracterizando a los que son fumadores, exfumadores, y estamos estimando a través de los riesgos relativos cuánto del total de muertes que ocurren en México son atribuibles al consumo de tabaco, y allí estamos haciendo el análisis no solo a nivel global, sino que estamos viendo las 4 enfermedades más importantes, que son cáncer de pulmón, infarto agudo de miocardio, enfermedad cerebrovascular y el EPOC. Sin embargo, este modelo tiene la ventaja de que también puede predecir el impacto sobre otros tipos de cáncer y el impacto sobre otro tipo de patologías a nivel de la población. Bueno, el otro punto que también es muy importante es mirar cuál es la relación que existe entre las políticas y las prevalencias del tabaquismo. Entonces, si bien es cierto, les comentaba el doctor Levy que tiene diferentes usos este tipo de modelos de simulación, es muy importante que quede claro que estos modelos de simulación se basan en la evidencia científica. Y bueno, una de las ventajas es tener evidencia científica local de México, de tal manera que me permita tener unos inputs de muy buena calidad para poder posteriormente tener unos resultados que se aproximen a la realidad del país o a la realidad donde se está implementando este modelo de simulación. Nosotros aquí en México estamos trabajando con la literatura local, tenemos la asesoría de expertos multidisciplinarios y también estamos incorporando las teorías y los marcos conceptuales desde el punto de vista epidemiológico, económico, sociológico, psicológico, clínico, de un grupo multidisciplinario e intersectorial que está aportando su perspectiva para poder hacer un modelo de este tipo complejo, pero que sea bastante sólido y válido en sus resultados. El otro punto es muy importante. Él hablaba que estos modelos de simulación sirven para hacer abogacía, posicionar el problema con los tomadores de decisiones, con los legisladores. Entonces, una de las formas estratégicas para caracterizar las políticas es básicamente acoplarse a las recomendaciones que establece actualmente el Convenio Marco para el control del tabaco de la Organización Mundial de la Salud y las 6 estrategias más costo efectivas para controlar. Entonces, ustedes las pueden ver aquí y son las estrategias que nosotros estamos modelando en el caso de México. Un poco en qué vamos nosotros en este ejercicio de trabajo conjunto. Básicamente hemos proporcionado toda la información de las fuentes de información como tal, hemos alimentado el modelo y estamos en esta primera fase, que es la fase de introducción de datos y de calibración del modelo, ajustando los parámetros de tal manera que nosotros podamos verificar que el modelo de simulación es capaz de replicar la realidad que estamos teniendo en México, tanto en términos de la prevalencia como en términos de el impacto en la morbimortalidad. Entonces, esa es una parte muy importante que estamos trabajando ahora. Ahora les quiero mostrar un poco los datos de los otros países y cómo nosotros estamos replicando en México esta estrategia. Así queremos ver nuestros resultados finales, donde nosotros podemos observar cuál ha sido el comportamiento, digamos, que ha tenido la prevalencia de consumo de tabaco y cómo es sensible, cómo el impacto de las diferentes políticas que se han implementado a través del tiempo pueden impactar este tipo de consumo de tabaco en la población. Y bueno, se hace una referencia contra el grupo de comparación, que es el mismo caso de México, pero en una situación en la cual no hubiera ocurrido ningún tipo de política. Entonces, nosotros estamos esperanzados que en muy corto tiempo nosotros podamos replicar una diapositiva como esta de Brasil para poder mostrar cuál ha sido el verdadero impacto que ha tenido cada una de las políticas que se ha implementado en el país en estos últimos 10 años y poder también hacer lobbying con los legisladores, qué es lo que está pendiente hacer en México para alcanzar una prevalencia menor del 12%, como dice ahí, en el 2020, o como hay otras estimaciones que hablan que en el 2040 a nivel global tengamos unas prevalencias de consumo menor al 5%. Este es el caso de las encuestas de Minnesota. Quiero decirles también, ahora que me están escuchando de varios estados, que este tipo de modelos se pueden replicar no solo para los datos nacionales, sino que en un momento dado se pueden replicar también para datos estatales, o si hubiese la información tan específica pudiesen modelarse para los casos de algunas ciudades capitales o de algunos municipios como tal. Entonces se puede trabajar a diferentes niveles, no solamente a nivel de un país o a nivel de un estado, también a nivel de un municipio, también se puede trabajar a nivel de una región como tal, o pues se pueden hacer bastantes comparaciones a nivel global. Todo depende de la cantidad de información y de la calidad también de la información de datos que se necesitan ingresar al modelo para que nosotros podamos tener muy buenos resultados. Y bueno, aquí él hablaba mucho de esta experiencia de Irlanda, como las diferentes encuestas están mostrando sus datos, difieren entre ellas, pero sin embargo cuando se hace la tendencia, el modelo de simulación es capaz de de simular esta tendencia y encontrarse digamos como que dentro de los rangos de incertidumbre, y bueno, eso le da muchísima consistencia al modelo, que todo lo que se haga sobre él y los resultados que aporte pues van a ser bastante consistentes con lo que sí pudiera ocurrir en un futuro. Y esta última diapositiva, que en la que estamos nosotros en este momento de calibración. Como les mostraba el doctor Levy, tenemos muchas encuestas a nivel nacional que tocan el tema del tabaco. Sin embargo, estas encuestas tienen diferentes cuestionarios, diferentes formas de preguntar el tema de el consumo del tabaco, y bueno, un poco lo que estamos tratando de armonizar con el modelo es una definición única, de tal manera que el modelo pueda replicar esta tendencia y dentro de sus rangos de incertidumbre pueda replicar lo que se ha observado a nivel de las encuestas. Entonces, si ustedes ven la crucecita y las bolitas naranja, es lo que el modelo de simulación está replicando en este momento en cuanto al comportamiento en hombres y al comportamiento en mujeres. Y bueno, ahorita estamos bastante satisfechos porque el modelo está replicando la situación que ha ocurrido en México desde el 2000 hasta el 2002. Y más adelante, una vez tengamos este visto bueno de todos los expertos, vamos a comenzar a ya hacer las simulaciones de qué está ocurriendo, estas caídas que han ocurrido de acuerdo con las diferentes implementaciones de políticas que se ha dado en México. Si ahora pasamos a la siguiente parte, que es la sesión de preguntas. Cualquier duda o información, aquí les dejo nuestras páginas en las cuales ustedes podrán encontrar amplia información de los estudios de investigación que se han realizado en México, y en la parte final también he dejado los correos tanto del doctor Levy como el mío, por si tienen algunas dudas específicas que quieran preguntarnos o que quieran interactuar con nosotros para desarrollar algún tipo de modelo, y entonces pues se sientan ustedes con toda la libertad de hacer este tipo de preguntas. Muchas gracias.
Pues bueno, sí, muy interesante, qué barbaridad. Yo creo que como moraleja podemos simple y sencillamente decir, por favor no fumen. Así de simple y de sencillo. Y pues bueno, también lo que comentábamos hace un momento fuera de cámaras, el hecho de que, pues bueno, todo este intento de subir los precios y para evitar el consumo del cigarro, etcétera, pues bueno, no ha sido todo, ¿verdad? Faltaría una parte que es, como tú lo comentabas, el seguimiento de estas personas con la adicción. No nada más es el gusto, ¿verdad? Y el que suban los precios y que mucha gente pues dejará de consumirlo por eso, pero queda ese otro grupo importante que son las personas con este problema de adicción, y que pues bueno, ustedes que son los expertos y los encargados de todo eso, les dejamos el paquete para que vean qué es lo que vamos a ¿qué es lo que sigue, no? Porque yo creo que de alguna manera pues es una primera etapa como todo, al igual que los esfuerzos que se están haciendo con la obesidad, con el consumo de alimentos chatarra o de refrescos de cola. Pues bueno, yo creo que es una primera instancia, pero yo creo que nos queda un camino fuerte por seguir, y sobre todo pues bueno, una autovaloración y ubicarnos y ser sinceros cada quien de decir, bueno, lo que tengo es nada más el puro gusto o realmente ya es una adicción, y pues bueno, ya recurrirán a las instancias pertinentes para tratar este problema. Bueno, pues saludamos con mucho cariño como siempre a la sala de Nuevo León. Aquí estamos viendo a los doctores y a las personas que nos están haciendo el favor de vernos, como siempre. ¿Qué tal? ¿Cómo están? Allá en Nuevo León. Y pues bueno, antes de pasar a las preguntas, déjenme nada más comentarles lo siguiente. Vamos a seguir el mismo mecanismo que hemos llevado en todos los ciclos anteriores. Sus constancias de participación se les van a enviar. Vamos ahorita a proyectar la lámina donde viene el correo de una servidora. Los que no nos conocen, es la maestra de Salud Teller. Y las personas que se conectaron vía, pues obviamente, Webex, tuvieron que haber mandado sus datos, su correo, etcétera. A estas personas no tienen que volvernos a enviar un correo para solicitar su constancia. Nosotros por sistema se las vamos a enviar en formato PDF a través de su correo electrónico. Y las personas que vieron esta videoconferencia en sala, igual también me hacen llegar, como siempre, en un formato de Excel, los nombres y los correos, al igual si presenciaron en alguna sala o en algún auditorio o en alguna oficina oficina, compartieron las computadoras. Igual manera, por favor, háganme llegar en un formato de Excel, pues los nombres correctos, mayúsculas, minúsculas, con sus acentos, para que de igual manera vía electrónica les hagamos llegar sus constancias. Pues la próxima videoconferencia será el 25 de marzo, ya estamos en la tercera, factores de susceptibilidad genética para cáncer cérvico-uterino, y el ponente será en esta ocasión el doctor Vicente Madrid Marín. Entonces vamos a dar por terminada esta sesión del día de hoy, esta videoconferencia, y les recordamos que el próximo 25 de marzo a la misma hora, a las 12 horas del centro de México, vamos a tener la videoconferencia Factores de susceptibilidad genética para cáncer cérvico-uterino. El ponente en esta ocasión va a ser el doctor Vicente Madrid Marina, gran investigador y amigo de aquí del instituto. No nos resta más que, pues bueno, a nombre de la doctora Laura Magaña Valladares, nuestra secretaria académica, pues darles las gracias por haber estado el día de hoy con nosotros. Nos seguimos viendo, vamos hacia la tercera videoconferencia de este 12º ciclo de videoconferencias interactivas 2014, Agenda de la Salud Pública, Retos y Prioridades. Muchísimas gracias, que tengan ustedes muy buena tarde, y muchísimas gracias por haber estado aquí con nosotros. Y bueno, seguimos adelante, que tengan ustedes una muy buena tarde. Gracias.